Okay, so today we're going to take a look at the end of the Cold War. Relax, pay attention, enjoy the ride. Vietnam is located in Southeast Asia. The US government feared it would fall to communism. So let's take a look at the impact of American policy in both Vietnam and in the US.
They did not all meet with success, but none failed as catastrophically as American attempts at nation-building in Vietnam. Vietnam and its neighbors in Southeast Asia were colonized by the French in the 19th century. French Indochina, as it was known, was the crown jewel in France's vast empire until the beginning of World War II, when Japan invaded the region and seized control of Vietnam. When the war ended in 1945, France sought to reclaim its colony. They were opposed by a communist organization called the Viet Minh. Their leader was a Vietnamese nationalist named Ho Chi Minh. Ho dreamed of uniting his country under one independent government. France fought the Viet Minh for 8 years in the First Indochina War before suffering a devastating defeat in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. French forces withdrew from Vietnam, while Ho's popularity spread throughout the country. But Vietnam became a pawn in the emerging Cold War. During ceasefire negotiations, the country was divided. Ho and his communist government would rule North Vietnam. A new Western-backed government was created in the South. American leaders feared that all of Vietnam would turn communist. They pushed aside the French and supported South Vietnamese Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem. Vietnam itself was not strategically important to the U.S., but American leaders feared that if Vietnam fell to communism, other countries in the region would follow. This became known as the domino principle.
Finally, you have broader considerations that might follow what you would call the falling domino principle. You have a row of dominoes set up and you knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is certainly that it'll go over very quickly. So you could have a beginning of a disintegration that would have the most profound influence.
The tragedy that followed was epic in its scope and senselessness. Billions of dollars and more than 50,000 American lives were spent to stop the dominoes from falling. In the process, the United States laid waste to much of the country and killed more than 3 million people. But the justification for war in Vietnam was fatally flawed. Ho was a communist, but he was not a puppet of Moscow, as the U.S. feared. His resistance was based on a fierce patriotism that inspired his people to fight on, even in the face of almost inconceivable losses. With the benefit of military support from the Soviet Union and Communist China, they frustrated the U.S. for 2 decades. Finally, in 1975, a tired and demoralized United States abandoned the war. The last Americans were evacuated from South Vietnam, and communist forces overran the capital city of Saigon.
But these events, tragic as they are, portend neither the end of the world nor of America's leadership in the world.
In the end, the dominoes didn't fall. But the communist victory did influence the Cold War. In the 1970s, the United States endured a crisis of self-confidence that came to be known as the Vietnam Syndrome. Americans lost faith in their government. Political leaders lost faith in their military. The country questioned its role in foreign affairs. No one had any taste for another Vietnam. This view contributed to an easing of international relations during the decade known as détente. In the Soviet Union, the effects of the Vietnam War were even more far-reaching. Emboldened by the communist victory and America's ambivalence toward foreign affairs, Kremlin leaders spent lavishly to build their arsenals and extend their communist empire around the world. It was, in effect, a brazen attempt to overtake the United States and win the Cold War. It would be, however, their greatest mistake.
Now we're going to take a look at both the positive and negative contributions of President Richard Nixon to the office of the presidency.
Well, I'm not a crook.
Number 37, Richard M. Nixon, Republican, 1969 to 1974, 56 years old, from California. Nixon was one of the most experienced politicians of the 20th century. He'd been a congressman, U.S. senator, and vice president. But by the time he finally became president, he had also accumulated many enemies.
Nixon always kept lists of enemies, and he really saw the presidency in large part as a vehicle for punishing his enemies and rewarding his friends, and for promoting his own image.
He had within him demons, personal demons, that he really could not control. He's a man who bore deep resentments against his enemies and thought his enemies were everywhere.
What's the matter with these clowns?
Nixon's paranoia was rooted in deep insecurity. Ambitious to a fault, he harbored a desperate need to prove himself and rise above his middle-class origins. Nixon's personality reflected his management style. He was obsessed with power and had to be in control at all times. Nixon bypassed the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense so that he and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, could control foreign policy.
Nixon wanted to run foreign policy out of the White House, and partly he wanted to do so because he was smarter about foreign policy, but partly because he wanted to do it in a secretive fashion.
Publicly, Nixon endorsed a plan to end America's involvement in Vietnam. Privately, Nixon escalated the war effort by bombing Cambodia and sending the Marines to invade Laos. In May 1969, when the New York Times revealed the secret bombings, Nixon went ballistic. He ordered wide-scale wiretapping of government officials and journalists to try and trace the leak.
This was really the beginning of the in-house wiretapping in the Nixon administration, arguably the beginning of Watergate as we understand that term, sort of all of the secret illegal doings that Nixon and Kissinger and others participated in.
While Nixon and Kissinger had surreptitiously intensified the conflict in Vietnam, they also pursued a radical new plan to end it.
And the architecture that Nixon and Kissinger come up with is what's called a triangular diplomacy, in which we disengage from Vietnam while playing Russia and China off against each other.
Nixon understood that the key to peace in Vietnam was a good relationship with China, Vietnam's ally. Toward this, he forged a diplomatic relationship with the Chinese, then brokered an agreement with Hanoi in January 1973.
That we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam.
He saw that was really the only way he could ultimately pull out of Vietnam. He also saw this as an opportunity to exert leverage on the Soviet Union. And he very effectively sort of played both sides of the fence. Even as he was making the overtures to China, he was also talking with Brezhnev about starting to improve relations.
Nixon's visit to China in February 1972, followed by the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty with the Soviets in May, were the crowning achievements of his presidency. These diplomatic breakthroughs with the communist world secured Nixon's landslide re-election later that year. It also led to an official ceasefire in Vietnam. In January 1973, North Vietnam and South Vietnam agreed to stop fighting. But secretly, and without the consent of Congress, Nixon promised the president of South Vietnam that the U.S. would restart bombing North Vietnam if Hanoi violated the accord. Simultaneously, in 1973, a political scandal was heating up: Watergate.
Nixon's wiretapping of reporters, the infiltration of the student movement, the infiltration of the Black Panther movement, the possible overthrow of the Chilean government. All these things were hanging around like fireflies on a summer night when the Watergate story hit.
Nixon fought the inevitable for 2 torturous years, believing that he, as president, was somehow above the law.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
In July 1974, after 14 months of congressional hearings on Watergate, the House Judiciary Committee passed an article of impeachment, charging Nixon with obstruction of justice. But before the House could vote to impeach, Nixon resigned on August 9th.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president.
He was angry. He was very angry at his enemies, but he was also angry at himself. As he looked back, he said, "I gave my enemies a sword, and they ran me through."
Nixon's legacy is divided, much like the man himself. On the one hand, he was a brilliant strategist. On the other, he will always be tarnished by Watergate. And he is the only president to resign. After escorting the Nixons to their helicopter, Vice President Gerald Ford silently walked back inside the White House and took the oath of office.
So help me God.
My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is
Okay, class, let's turn to the presidency, focusing on Jimmy Carter and what happens during his time as president.
Jimmy Carter ran for president in 1976 as a Washington outsider, a Democrat who wasn't stained by the politics of the nation's capital. The wealthy peanut farmer served 4 years in the Georgia State Senate and 1 term as governor. That meant he wasn't associated with Watergate or Vietnam. He made a point of being folksy and informal. The strategy helped him beat President Ford. However, it also made his time as president miserable. As an outsider, Carter had a troubled relationship with Congress, even though Congress was controlled by Democrats. He was a fiscal conservative, and he shot down a few bills that Congress liked. Carter had a few wins. He established a national energy policy, and his plan to cut back regulations of the airline industry was a success. But the public mostly saw him as an ineffective legislative leader without a coherent agenda. So when things went wrong, Carter took a lot of the blame. Inflation, oil prices, and unemployment rose during his presidency. Worst of all, in late 1979, revolutionaries in Iran took U.S. embassy workers hostage, and Carter seemed powerless to help them. He wasn't able to lift the country out of its funk, and he wasn't ready to deal with the charisma of Ronald Reagan in the election of 1980. But Carter found purpose after the presidency and won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002 for his humanitarian efforts around the world.
Now we're going to turn to the presidency of Ronald Reagan and see how the Cold War comes to a conclusion.
Ronald Reagan was known as the Great Communicator, which shouldn't be surprising. He was a radio announcer before becoming a movie and television star. He got a taste of leadership as the president of the Screen Actors Guild, and starting in 1967, he served 2 terms as the Republican governor of California. Voters liked what he was communicating in 1980 and elected him in a landslide over President Carter. His message was simple: the government was too big and tax cuts would help the struggling economy grow. He had a mixed record of doing something about it. After he was shot in an assassination attempt, his his approval rating soared, and Congress agreed to tax cuts to spark economic growth, and the economy eventually grew like wildfire. He had less luck shrinking government. The national debt exploded, as Reagan oversaw huge increases in defense spending as his way of standing up once and for all to the Soviet Union. Of course, that spending had a purpose. Reagan once called the Soviet Union the evil empire, and he thought it didn't have the economic strength to keep up with America's military expansion. It worked. Soviet leaders agreed to new levels of diplomacy that phased out the Cold War. Reagan had some missteps, like the Iran-Contra affair, but America loved his sunny optimism, and he was a great salesman for conservative views. Many Republican politicians of today consider him their hero.
Reagan's political popularity was picking up momentum, and by 1980 he landed in the White House. Then, 2 months later, tragedy struck. In a failed assassination attempt, Reagan was shot. Reagan's speedy recovery put him back in the White House, and he easily slipped into a second term as president.
Thank you very much.
By 1987, Reagan signed the landmark nuclear arms treaty with the Soviet Union, officially ending the Cold War.
There is a great bond that draws the American and Soviet peoples together. It is the common dream of peace.
Okay, please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or need any extra help.
That's all, folks.